So our next speaker is Aditya Grover. Aditya is a third-year PhD candidate in computer science at Stanford University, affiliated with the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab and the Statistical Machine Learning Group. He's advised by Stefano Ormon. Aditya's research is centered on algorithms for probabilistic reasoning using generative models and statistical relational learning with real-world applications in computational sustainability. Aditya, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you all for coming. So my name is Aditya, and today I'm going to talk about a generative modeling framework for graph data that we call as Graphite. And this is joint work with Aaron Zweig and my advisor, Stefano Ormon. So like many other scientific disciplines, the field of natural sciences is also in the midst of a data revolution. So we have the Large Hadron Collider that's collecting about 25 million gigabytes of data every year. The databases from astronomic and even biological databases are not too far behind on the scale. And the question to ask when we see these vast amounts of data is that how can we make efficient inferences? And one solution that deep learning has done really well is to get lots and lots of labels, train very deep models, and get very accurate predictions. But with these volumes of data, which is often very streaming, high-dimensional, structured, it's not a feasible solution to get labels for the vast amounts of data that we're collecting. An alternate approach is to build generative models of data. So people understand generative models in various ways, and everyone has a different criteria for what it means to be a good generative model. But there are certain aspects of a good generative model that we as a community have begun to appreciate when we design algorithms. So here are three of them. So a good generative model learns a probability distribution over data. So if it sees data coming from a data set that we are trying to model, it will assign it high probability and low probability to points otherwise. It should be able to generate the data as well. So that is what we refer to as sampling from the data distribution. It should also be able to learn latent features that can describe the data points. So when we see data, it could have a lot of structure, but it could be in a representation where we cannot efficiently exploit the structure. So we want generative models that can discover the structure and learn useful representations for the structure. So the simplest representation of such a generative model would be a latent variable model. So you have some source of randomness z that tries to explain the data that we observe. So these random variables z are not observed, and hence they're called latent variables. And we try to learn a conditional distribution that takes us from these latent variables to the data that we actually observe. So particularly relevant to this talk is the question, what kind of data that we're trying to model? So data could have structure in various forms. So we have seen excellent generative models for images, text, audio, and video. This talk is going to talk about generative models for a different modality, which is graphs. So when we think about graphs, we should think about why is it important to build generative models for graphs. And the reason why this is an important problem is because graphs are ubiquitous. So particularly in the field of natural sciences, you have ecology where domain scientists try to model the food web relationships between different organisms as a graph. In biology, you have networks of brain connections. You have protein-protein interactions. In chemistry, you can think of a molecule as a graph itself. The atoms are your nodes, and the connections or the bonds between the atoms are your edges. And because so many different kinds of data can be modeled as a graph, we need to think of what is the base representation that we're going to be working with if we have to build generative models of graphs. And the representation or the notation that I'm going to be using throughout this talk is I'm going to represent the graph as a tuple, where the first element of this tuple is going to be an adjacency matrix. So if you have n nodes in a graph, the I comma j entry of an adjacency matrix is telling whether node I is connected to node j. Additionally, you can have additional structure for a graph. So think about molecules. If you're representing an atom as a node in a graph, you also know properties about the atom such as its atomic weight, its melting point, its boiling point. And these serve as additional sources of information which we model through the feature matrix. So the feature matrix is n times m, and every row of this feature matrix denotes a pre-existing feature information that we know about the node in the graph. Okay, so another technical point throughout this talk, if you ever see an upward pointing arrow, that's a superscript, and a downward pointing arrow is a subscript. We made great progress in machine learning, but we still suffer from a lot of technical glitches. Okay, so we want to learn latent variable models of graph, but we want to learn expressive latent variable models. So we would be transforming this simple graphical model that we have in our head into an actual architecture that we can learn. So earlier I said you have the source of randomness z and this observed data y. So in our case, the observed data y is the graph, and we assume that the feature matrix is known, and we are trying to infer the connectivity structure through a set of latent variables z. So if you've seen these kinds of models before, or even if you haven't, it's worth noting that in our modeling, we are assuming the latent vector not as a vector, but as a matrix. So the latent matrix z here consists is of dimensions n times k. So every row of this matrix is denoting a feature representation that's hidden for every node in the graph. And we'll soon see why we are preferring this kind of modeling of a matrix as opposed to a simple vector representation for the graph. Okay, and in between your latent variables and your graphs, you can have the conditional distribution parameterized by expressive functions, or what we commonly call now as deep neural nets. Okay, so throughout this talk, I'm going to keep on stressing on the fact that graphs are different from the existing generative models, modalities like images, text, and video. So why is that? So the reason for that is that the inductive biases and the invariances that we want to see in deep neural networks when we're trying to model graphs are very different from the ones that we have seen for existing modalities that we do really well on. So when you think about images, we want to capture things like translation invariance, for which we know convolution neural networks do really well. For text and speech, we care about long-term temporal structure, and we have recurrent neural nets. Videos require both spatial and temporal structure, because of which we resort to hybrids of these architectures. So to think about graphs, what are the kind of invariances that we want to capture within our neural network architecture? So there are three of them that I'm going to talk about. The first is local structure. So again, structure here is defined locally, but it's defined locally in terms of shortest paths on a graph. So we want nodes which are close to one another as defined by shortest paths to have similar representations. The second thing is permutation invariance. So if you're using an adjacency matrix as a representation for a graph, I can symmetrically switch the ordering of the nodes, both rows and columns, and the graph does not change. But the neural network architecture should be invariant to these kinds of permutations in our input representation as well. The third is resizing. So we want to build a generative models of graphs, but we could have graphs with different number of nodes. And we want the same architecture to be able to learn a generative model with graphs having different number of nodes. So some of these problems, like the permutation invariance problems, are hard. So we do not know if we can get an exact solution to this. But in recent work, there has been great progress in trying to capture many of these kinds of inductive biases on networks. In particular, the hammer that I'm going to be using for this talk is one of graph convolutional network. So let's see what a graph convolutional network is. So a graph convolutional network, again, performs the multiplication of some signal. So here, the signal that you should be thinking of is the feature matrix associated with a graph with some parameterized filter that we'll try to learn eventually. But we do so in the Fourier space of the graph Laplacian. So The graph Laplacian is a very commonly occurring object in graph theory, and it has fundamental importance when we think about graphs. I won't go into the details, but this is like a very simple formula of how you would apply a graph convolution. The key thing to notice in this formula is that there is this matrix U, which is the eigenvector matrix for the graph Laplacian. And computing this matrix is expensive. So what graph convolutional networks bring to the table is an efficient first-order approximation to computing a graph convolution. So the formula looks messy, but what it's essentially doing is computing a forward pass from the L-1 layer to L layer in a neural network. And what it does is it applies this nonlinearity eta to the adjacency matrix with some other terms for the degree and the previous layer activations along with the weight matrix that we are trying to learn. So you should think of it multiplying three matrices. You can club the D and the A terms to be as one of them. Then you have the hidden layer activations from the previous layer. And finally, the parameters that you're trying to learn. And at the end, you apply this nonlinearity eta. OK, so now we have this hammer, and we need a nail. So we're going to do variational autoencoding using graph convolutional networks. And what a variational autoencoder does is that it tries to learn the latent variable model that we had a few slides back by maximizing the marginal likelihood of the observed data. So the marginal log likelihood in the case of a graph is that it's trying to predict the adjacency matrix through this distribution P that's parameterized by these parameters theta. But maximizing this objective is computationally intractable because it requires us to integrate all the latent factors of variation that could be contributing to this sum. So what we do instead in variational inference is that we introduce a posterior network Q that's an approximation to the true posterior over the latent variables. And we also specify this using a deep neural network with a different set of parameters phi. So we jointly learn these parameters theta and phi by maximizing a lower bound to the true objective. Because the true objective is intractable, we can't directly optimize it, but we can compute an efficient, compute a tractable lower bound through this variational posterior distribution Q. OK. Now the key question is what is the encoder and decoder that is suited for doing variational autoencoding over graphs. So the encoder that we're going to use is going to be a graph convolutional network that takes as input in the first layer the feature matrix associated with a graph and the adjacency matrix, performs a graph convolution to get the first layer of activations. We can repeat this process. We get another we apply another graph convolution using the same adjacency matrix and the previous layer activations. And at the end, we get the parameters that specify our variational posterior. So in this case, we are assuming a multivariate Gaussian. So we get the means and the log covariances associated with the multivariate Gaussian. What's interesting is we are in a fix when we think about how should we decode a latent representation to a graph. So to draw an analogy with convolutional neural nets, we have figured out how to do a convolution through the encoding process, but now with a graph convolution. But we still haven't found the deconvolution operation that should take a latent representation and reconstruct the graph that was originally fed. So what we do here is we adopt an alternate representation of graph convolutional networks, which is one of message passing. So what it does is our decoder constructs an initial guess for the graph. So the way it constructs an initial guess is it computes the dot product between the latent features for every node. So now you see why we're using a matrix representation. We can construct an initial guess of the graph by taking the feature vectors for the nodes. And if they're similar, they'll have a high dot product. And it's more likely that they'll have an edge existing. And then we refine this initial guess of the graph using graph convolutions. So the key bottleneck that we had that we, while thinking of decoding was that we didn't have a graph to begin with. But now by using this inner product decoder, we get an initial guess of the graph, which we can then feed into a graph convolution. So we repeat this process, and we can get multiple layers of decoding for a graph. And at the end, what we find empirically to work well in practice is to take a convex combination of the initial feature that we had and the feature that we get after applying multiple layers of graph convolution on our intermediate graph guesses. And taking these convex combinations, we get a feature matrix that we ultimately use to get a probability distribution for reconstructing the original graph. OK. Now, to quickly move on to the experiments. So we experimented with a link prediction. So link prediction tries to answer the simple question: if I give you two nodes in a graph, is there likely to be an edge between these two nodes? So what we do is we take our graph, we split it into a train and validation and test, a 95-5 split, and we consider different algorithms that have been used for link prediction. So classically, people have used spectral methods. More recently, there have been methods based on random walks like deep walk, which do very well in learning embeddings for nodes that can be used with an inner product step to compute the probability of an edge existing between the two nodes. We can also consider another relevant baseline, which is the variational graph autoencoder, where we have a single step inner decoder. So we don't apply any graph convolution over our initial guess. We just apply one level of dot products to get our initial guess for the graph. So this task can be thought of as denoising. We feed an incomplete graph, and we are trying to complete the graph by predicting the missing edges. We experiment on lots of benchmark data sets for citation networks and protein-protein interaction networks, and we evaluate the standard AUC and average precision. So let's see the results. So we find that so first let's see the results for AUC. We find that in all the cases, almost all the cases, we find that the Graphite autoencoding and variational autoencoding frameworks outperform the competing methods. And the same is true if we change our metric to average precision. So in both cases, we see that the Graphite is able to better model the structure present in graphs. OK, we can also do some qualitative analysis where we visualize the latent space. So here what we do is we take the latent representations that are learned by Graphite, and we cluster them and project them into a 2D space using TSNE. And we can see that even here, we can see well-separated clusters based on true labels that were not showed to the network at all. Because this is an unsupervised algorithm, we didn't show any labels, but it's still able to discover this hidden structure present in graphs. OK, so this is my final slide. To conclude, we presented a generative modeling framework for graphs based on variational autoencoding. And we showed how it outperforms state-of-the-art methods for link prediction. We also have ongoing work which look at different kind of inference tasks based on Graphite, such as synthesizing or sampling graphs, as well as semi-supervised methods for classifying nodes as well as entire graphs. OK, so one final takeaway, perhaps the most important one from this talk. My outstanding co-author is an undergraduate, and he's applying for PhD admissions. So anyone here on the admissions committee should look into his application. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. So we have just time for a couple of questions at most. Don't be shy. Yeah, right there.
When you use the reconstructed graph of the decoder,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like it's fully connected.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we are learning a distribution over graphs.
So you're sampling from the distribution?
Yeah. OK.
I wonder what happens if the graph nodes are not fixed themselves, if they can also be like how many nodes there are in the graph.
So if I understand the question correctly, you're trying to predict. So you have a graph where you have nodes that you have not observed.
Yeah, we know it's something generate that more.
That's a good question. So one thing which I did not go too much into in this talk was what is this feature matrix X? Because you can think of cases where you don't have explicit features associated with every node. So you can think of it as specifying an identity matrix. So going back to your question, which is predicting how many nodes exist in the graph based on the existing graph, I'm not sure, but I think it's indeed an interesting experiment to try.
Okay, I think we have to currently move on to the next talk, but hopefully you'll be able to find him during a lunch break and ask all of your questions. Thanks again.
Thank you.